Union merged with a bigger one last year. About 10,000 customers had their deposits moved without a hitch.
Two former federal banking officials allege that Creighton Federal Credit Union needed a lifeline. Our Mike McKnight finds a shocking number in tonight's First Alert 6 investigation.
Over more than 70 years, Creighton Federal Credit Union grew to almost 10,000 members with 5-star reviews and several branches. Then in August, it merged with Cobalt Federal Credit Union, which on its website offers an explanation that the former president of Creighton Federal Credit Union retired. Two former government banking officials claim there's more to the story.
This feels like a shotgun wedding.
A merger orchestrated by the National Credit Union Administration is the opinion of a former Assistant Secretary to the U.S. Treasury and banking watchdog Aaron Klein. With the Brookings Institution, he examined Creighton Federal Credit Union's last two financial filings.
The bank had $6 million of capital April 30th, is in the hole $7 million 3 months later, and there's an accounting line $12.5 million went lost miscellaneous. It's $12.5 million, and it's called miscellaneous non-interest expense.
A line below that shows Creighton Federal Credit Union more than $13.5 million in the hole and listed on the report about the time of the merger.
Well, the NCUA has given no explanation for where the money went.
A former program director with the National Credit Union Administration says the agency should provide an explanation of the Creighton Federal Credit Union's last bottom line.
So how do you lose 20% of the value of an institution? In this case, $13.6 million of members' money, because this is the members' money in 90 days.
Is there a logical explanation for that? I mean, is there something in the figures that we're not seeing that is, acceptable, or is there something highly suspicious?
Why isn't that explanation being offered, and what is being done then to pursue the $13 million?
Last spring, the National Credit Union Association call report on Creighton Federal Credit Union stated the financial institution was well capitalized. And the next report, 90 days later, changed that to critically undercapitalized.
Something went on here because $13 million just doesn't disappear from a credit union of this size in 3 months.
A spokesperson for the National Credit Union Administration declined comment because it involves confidential supervisory information.
The regulator is responsible for ensuring that that information is provided to members.
Creighton Credit Union members deserve to know what happened to their equity in the credit union.
Though customers never lost money from their federally insured accounts at Creighton Federal Credit Union, two financial watchdogs say members are owed an explanation for the loss of their financial institution. In Omaha, Mike McKnight, First Alert 6.
Our messages to Cobalt Federal Credit Union have not been returned. Cobalt's website does offer answers for former members of Creighton Federal Credit Union about the merger.
Creighton University tells Mike Creighton Federal Credit Union was an independent organization entirely separate from the university.